All right then. Thank you everybody for joining us today. It's my great honor to host today's Belgrade Legal Theory Group session. Today we have great pleasure to host Matija Žgur, Research Fellow in Legal Philosophy at the Legal Department of Roma Tre University. Matija will today present us and tell us something more about the Slovenian experience in regard to COVID-19 related emergency measures, which started in Slovenia, at March 12, when the declaration of epidemic took place. As Matija mentioned before, but not a lot of people were here then. There wasn't state of emergency in Slovenia, only state of epidemic. Here, I would like to just say that it's additional benefit to have Matija with us today because he was an expert in emergency norms even before COVID-19. Namely, he wrote an amazing paper in 2017 about the state of emergency constitutional design in Slovenian order. So I hope he will tell us something more about that today. For those who don't know the rules of these sessions, first half of an hour will be dedicated to Matija's presentation, and second half an hour will be dedicated to Q&As. If you want to ask Matija questions, just raise a hand. You have a little icon of a hand there. I will note it, and later I will invite you to ask a question. I won't speak much any longer. Matija, the floor is yours.
Laura, thanks to everyone. I hope you can hear me well and see me as well. All right. So thanks for this invitation, especially to Teodora and to Bojan and to the whole of the Belgrade Legal Theory Group. And thanks for joining in. That ought to be used during the state of emergency and several problems related to this issue. Now, I say ought to because, and Teodora already, the state of emergency, not only has it not been declared during the COVID pandemic in Slovenia, but it has never actually been declared in Slovenia's history. This is, I think, also partly the reason why Slovenian legal scholars have not been thus far interested much in this legal instrument, and which brings us to an important consequence which regards this speech in particular. That is, with the lack of prior practical experience and with almost no academic materials to go with, my speech will be purely speculative, the result of my own ideas, my own investigations on the issue, and it is completely falsifiable by any future possible events. So it will be made completely different once if the state of emergency is going to be declared in Slovenia. So I want you to keep that in mind as I go on. I thought about structuring this half an hour or so into 4 parts. First, I'll just make some brief remarks on the current epidemiological and political situation in Slovenia, which are, I think, important for today's discussion. Then I'll talk briefly in general on the legal regulation of the state of emergency in Slovenia, especially on some particular issues. And then I'll focus on the question of the how part of the type of legal acts that ought to be used in the state of emergency. And then, time allowing, I'll discuss briefly the current situation, how the current government handled the pandemic, and why did it do so in the manner that it did. So first, 3 brief remarks on the situation. First of all, the epidemic situation in Slovenia is quite favorable, let's say. Slovenia was not hit particularly hard with the epidemic. I should note that it's a very small country with inhabitants, and it had approximately until today 1,500 cases, with approximately 100 people dying as a cause of the disease, whereby the characteristic of the victims are quite similar as in other countries, meaning that they are mostly, predominantly, senior citizens over 85 years of age with pre-existing conditions of the kind. So the current prognosis is very good. There's maybe one case if per day of newly discovered COVID. And so the current government, I think just today, said that perhaps probably by the end of the month, the epidemic cancelled. So let's hope for that. The restrictive measures that the government adopted were quite similar as in other countries: restrictions on the freedom of movement, the closure of economic activities, schools, bars, and restaurants. What is more interesting, and if we'll have the time, we can discuss that later on, there were some attempts by the government and the national the powers of the government or of the police to, let's say, regulate the budget in a more free manner, or to the police to control the privacy of the citizens. The famous tracing apps was also an unsuccessful attempt to pass some broader police powers for the military in controlling the southern border. The last remark I want to make in this beginning is quite an interesting one, and that is just prior to the declaration of the epidemic, Slovenia, for the first time in its history, had a minority government of about 5 or 6 parties, with the external support of a left-wing party, which at the beginning of this year withdrew its support for the government, and it became increasingly hard for the minority government to pass bigger political projects through the parliament. So just a week or two prior to the declaration of the epidemic, the prime minister, given the system, the Slovenian system of election, had for about 2 weeks a situation where we had the old government still doing regular business and a newly elected prime minister, but without a cabinet. And it was precisely during this time that the epidemic was declared by the previous government in accordance, of course, with the new prime minister. And I think a day or two after the declaration of the epidemic, did the new government began to fully function. Now, I mentioned this because later on I'll discuss some problems with the in abstract or legal regulation of the state of emergency in Slovenia, and we will see that a possible scenario where we would have a minority government could make things additionally problematic, as if they were not already on the basis of the law. So briefly on the regulation of the state of emergency in Slovenia. The Constitution contains Article 92, which states, among other things, the following: a state of emergency shall be declared whenever a great and general danger threatens the existence of the state. Now, these terms, great and general danger, existence of the state, are obviously very vague and unclear terms, specifically with respect to what kind of events may fall under the term danger, and especially for the declaration, so the terms great and general danger. Now, if the foreign literature, and especially the case law of the European Court of Human Rights is to go by, states are afforded quite a large margin of appreciation in deciding what kind of events and of what kind of intensity they deem appropriate for the declaration of the state of emergency. So the court in Strasbourg believes that it is a contextual matter, with the states being best equipped to decide on the issue. So this is the when question. So when can the state of emergency be declared? The other part, so the ending of emergencies contains no so-called sunset clause. So in theory, the state of emergency can be prolonged indefinitely, or that is until the government decides that it wishes to propose its cessation. And of course, from the rule of law perspective and perspective of legal predictability, this is not the best solution. So it should be looked at in the future, I believe. The same Article 92 of the Constitution states the following: the declaration of the state of emergency, urgent measures, and their repeal shall be decided upon the National Assembly, that is the Parliament, on the proposal of the government. So we see that the primary decision maker with all things related to the emergency, that is the declaration, the repeal, and urgent measures during the emergency, is the National Assembly or the Parliament. But it may only adopt all of these decisions on the proposal of the government. Now, another article of the Constitution states that if, because of the emergency, the National Assembly were unable to convene, those powers, the same powers, would pass to the President of the Republic. And again, also the President would have the possibility of adopting measures only on the proposal of the government. Now, it should be said that this latter possibility of the powers passing to the President has been made virtually impossible, right, just recently, because the Parliament adopted a new rule in its rules of procedure, making it possible that it convenes also remotely using ICT tools. A possibility that previously did not exist, but now, due to the emergency, it made it possible. So it's very unlikely that emergency powers, if the state of emergency were ever to be adopted in Slovenia, it's very difficult to imagine that the Parliament would not be able to convene. Now, I think this solution that I just presented about who decides during the emergency is quite well balanced from both perspectives. If on the one hand, we have rule of law considerations, but on the other, we have efficiency considerations, I think it's quite a well-balanced solution. That's because, on the one hand, it limits the set of subjects who can propose emergency measures, and obviously it limits them to the government, which is, of course, the most well-equipped body to do so, to propose measures. And on the other hand, it does maintain a degree of separation of powers. However, of course, also this but it's unclear to what nationally modify the government's original proposal on urgent measure, let's say, or if it can, for example, decline to adopt them. So if the government, let's say, proposes the declaration of the state of emergency, what can the Parliament do in this respect? And here the minority government scenario kicks in, because it's not impossible to imagine that a government who doesn't have much political support or enough political support in the Parliament would be met with resistance from proposal to proposal, which would make guiding the emergency resolution quite difficult. Case, but it is an interesting issue to think about in the future, because it's quite obvious that such scenarios can present themselves. So if these were the how and the when problems, the focus of this short speech is the how problem. So how can the state or the National Assembly adopt emergency measures? Now, it's interesting that the Constitution is silent on the matter, so it does not say anything as to how the National Assembly should adopt its decisions during the emergency. Paradoxically, it's quite explicit when it comes to the President. So I said that it may be that the emergency powers are shifted to the President, and in these cases, the Constitution says that the President shall adopt all of these measures with decrees with the force of law. And it's also, I think, important to mention that decrees with the force of law in this respect are the only substatutory act in the Slovenian system which has the express force of law. So someone took a lot of things to think about carefully about what kind of act used by the President in the emergency situation. But again, same people did not think it important to be explicit when it comes to the Parliament, who is the primary decision maker. And we'll see that this causes certain problems. That's because the only rule that does determine what kind of acts are supposed to be used during an emergency are the Parliament's own rules of procedure. And there it is stated that with regards to all decisions related to Article 92 of the Constitution, which is the article that speaks about the state of emergency, the Parliament adopts this decision by ordinances. Now, ordinances are a type of substatutory act used by the Parliament for all kinds of issues. For example, it uses it to proclaim constitutional acts amending the Constitution, calls for referendum. It can order parliamentary inquiries or establish public enterprises, or it can regulate the manner of work and the relations within the National Assembly. So from all of these examples, we can see that it is a specific legal act. It's not a general legal act, but when it comes to the state of emergency, it can be used in this manner. Now, from an efficiency point of view, let's say, I think this is quite a good solution for the following reasons. First of all, because the procedure for the adoption of ordinances is highly simplified with respect to the ordinary legislative procedure. So it allows that the ordinances be adopted within the single session of Parliament instead of 2 or 3, which is the case with the normal legislative procedure. Also, compared to normal laws, ordinances have 2 specific characteristics which are valuable in such circumstances. That is, they are not subject to a possible National Council's suspensive veto. Now, the National Council is the second chamber of Parliament, but it's an extremely weak second chamber. So usually when we talk in Slovenia about the Parliament, we mean the National Assembly, although formally the National Council is the second chamber, but it has so weak powers that it's usually not considered. It does have these suspensive veto powers, which are usually quite easy to override, because instead of a normal majority, the Parliament, the National Assembly just needs a the full majority of all members of Parliament to pass. Not as laws are by the President of the Republic. You have to observe the with when them has to proclaim laws, which of course makes it an efficient tool for guiding Can you hear me? Okay, I thought you all stopped for a minute. And of course, this problem is, can ordinances really be used to temporarily suspend or restrict constitutional rights? Now, Article 16 of the Slovenian Constitution determines that only during the state of emergency can fundamental rights, constitutional rights, be temporarily suspended or restricted. Obviously, not even this article says in what kind of manner. So we have to deduct from the overall legal system. Now, another way of putting the same problem that I just mentioned is when the Parliament's rule of procedure determined that ordinances are to be used to decisions referring to Article 92 of the Constitution. Does this also apply to restrictions of human rights? Put in another way, does the term urgent measures from Article 92 include human rights suspensions from Article 16 of the Constitution? Now, obviously, there are 2 possibilities, a yes answer and a no answer. Let's say the first possibility is the yes answer. So yes, let's say that human rights restrictions from Article 16 do fall under Article 92 decisions or under the term urgent measures, and so human rights can be restricted with ordinances. What are the problems in this case? Well, this would, I think, kind of defy the fundamental value of constitutional rights. And this is an issue that last time Pedro talked about, and I think it was quite interesting to hear. I won't go into that much details, but let's say that, okay, the state of emergency does somehow reduce the fundamental value of constitutional rights, and it makes them normal rights, okay? But even with regards to normal rights and duties, the Slovenian constitution is quite explicit in saying that rights and duties of citizens, of individuals, can only be regulated or dictated by statute, by law. So from my studies right in this moment, I can't see any constitutional argument that would support this conclusion that human rights, constitutional rights, even during a state of emergency, can be regulated and especially suspended with a substatutory act. And if the constitution maker were to have this idea, I think it would be appropriate to put it explicitly in the constitution. So I think it should be, this solution should be rejected. Now, so we have the second possibility, the no answer, right? So we say we should exclude human rights suspensions and restrictions from the scope of the term urgent measures falling under Article 92 of the Constitution. And in this case, the only appropriate legal act by which human rights suspensions could be adopted, obviously, would be a law, a statute, right? And this would be a sound argument from the rule of law perspective. However, efficiency desideratum, let's say, problems with this, because this would imagine we are in a state of emergency. There's an actual real emergency that is to be resolved urgently and quickly. But now we would find ourselves that the government and also especially the National Assembly would have to adopt by two different procedures, by two different methods, measures. On the one hand, normal urgent measures, whatever that would be, and on the other hand, the human rights restrictions. So it would have to, the human rights restriction would have to be adopted by a legislative procedure. It would be open to vetoes by the National Council. Such laws would have to be declared by the President of the Republic, and there would be all kinds of delays in adopting such acts. On the other hand, all other urgent measures would be adopted by a simplified procedure for ordinances. So all in all, I think, just very briefly, both solutions can be defended, but also both have such negative consequences, either from the rule of law perspective or the efficiency perspective, that I think the morale of the story is that the system has not been well thought out, that the constitution makers were not particularly pressed by this issue, and don't think it will ever emerge. But in recent years, we've seen, especially let's say in 2015 with the migration crisis, and now of course with this pandemic, that numerous problems are present in this system as it is thought out at the moment. Now, just to conclude, I think this bad constitutional design of the situation of emergency is one of the reasons why the current government did not decide to declare the state of emergency and went about with the business as usual model, that is adopting measures that it did as if it were nothing were to happen, as in the normal kind of way. Now, not to say that everything went well, because there have been a lot of, I think, more than 50 constitutional court to examine the constitutionality of the acts of the substatutory acts that the government did adopt during this period, because it did so in a quite untransparent manner. To name just one example, for example, the Infectious Disease Act, which is the primary law in this regard, with regards to epidemics, stated that it is the Minister of Health who declares the epidemic and who can adopt the measures that were adopted. But it was the government that actually adopted these measures. And once it realized that there could be constitutional issues at play, it simply changed the law, which now states that it's the government who adopts these measures. So you can see that everything was done quite quickly, quite untransparently, and probably, I think this kind of procedure, business as usual model, is not only in Slovenia, but is present in many countries who are trying to evade the declaration of the state of emergency, because I think, but that's just my speculation, based on some articles that appear recently in Slovenia, they see the state of emergency as kind of a boogeyman, and I think which can unleash dogs of hell, illiberality and undemocratic tendencies, and which cannot be stopped. So the government, once it has these powers, it could not be stopped. And I think this is a wrong conclusion based on, I guess, some readings of Carl Schmitt. State of exception, state of emergency, believing that once the state of emergency is declared, the whole of the constitutional system is somehow suspended, and so only the pure force is unleashed. And I think that's completely mistaken. But this is the current situation. But as I said at the beginning, the government did promise that the epidemic will be ended by the end of the month. And right now it's up to the Constitutional Court, who is already working on some of these constitutional appeals, to decide on whether some of these measures taken by the government were constitutional or not. And we have to see what the court will say for any further analysis. So that's mostly it for my part. If there are any questions, requests for clarifications, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Can you all hear me? I'm sorry, my connection is slightly bad. Okay, you can hear me. Thank you, Matija, a lot for this great presentation. So I'll be collecting questions now. For the time being, I don't see a hand raised. Just a second. But I have many. Just a second. But I have a few questions. I have a few questions for until somebody raises their hands.
I'm having some trouble hearing you, but let's see.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. So before I see a question raised, I'd like to ask you, Matija. So first of all, you mentioned, I agree with you that the ordinances are not the appropriate, how to say this, channel in which the rights restrictions should be enforced. But now you mentioned that there should be a difference maybe between normal measures, which could be enforced by ordinances, and some human rights restriction measures, which could be passed by law. My question is, do you think that actually what the normal measures would be in that case? In the sense that, do you think that there is any emergency measure which does not really restrict the rights? That's one question. And the second question is in regard to your constitutional court. I think that when you have a strong constitutional court, the situation is much better in the terms of human rights restrictions. So even if something is disproportionate, the constitutional court will be there as a safeguard. As I read, I don't know if I'm wrong, that the constitutional court order stated an order in which they said that the government's restriction of movement was disproportionate. Is that true? I would like to hear something more about that, if you heard me and my question.
Yeah. Right. Perhaps, right? Okay. So as regards your first question, obviously that depends on what, and that's a political question or a realist question, if you wish. What does urgent measures mean, right? If we examine the current situation, so on the one hand, yes, the government adopted. What did they adopt? The government only adopted more or less measures that were in some aspect rights restricting, right? All other measures were adopted by Parliament. I'm generalizing here, but this is I think it's a right answer in this regard. All other measures were adopted by law by the National Assembly, and I'm here talking about economic measures for the sanctioning of the consequences of the epidemic, the privacy, the questions regarding the police powers, and so on. So these were left by the government to adopt by law, and on the other hand, the rights restricting measures, which is paradoxical, were adopted by the government by some other types of substatutory acts. So I think it all boils down to, if we were to be in a scenario of state of emergency, it all boils down to what the current government, the government in power in that moment, would regard as urgent measures. Now, obviously, let's imagine that a government and a parliament would be able to distinguish these two aspects and adopt normal, whatever that means, urgent measures by ordinances and human rights restricting measures by law. But let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that emergency powers were to fall to the president of the republic. Now, there is no possibility of such distinction, because the president only has the power to decrease state of emergency, obviously, decrease with the state of with the force of law. Of course, it wouldn't be a problem for the rule of law perspective, but of course, imagining that the president would be adopting not only rights restricting measures, but also economic measures, or I don't know what, especially if the emergency were prolonged, would be quite a problematic thing, I think, from a democracy point of view. So, as to most issues today, I have only speculated sound answers. As to your second question, it's not exactly as you said. What the court did is to suspend partially one of the ordinance movement, and it only said, it hasn't decided on merit yet, it only said that the government has to weekly perform a kind of proportionality test and see whether the reasons for these restrictions still exist. Now, I think 2 weeks have passed, and the government took it very lightly, and basically with no real argumentation, just says that, explains that yes, the situation still exists, that the necessity for these measures still exists, and so it continues to prolong the decision, the ordinance, or whatever act it was, by which it adopted this measure. So it's kind of clearly obviating its duty as stated by the Constitutional Court.
All right, thank you a lot. We have a question from Boyan, so you may start.
Thank you, Teodora, and thank you, Matija, for a great speech. So this is the second talk. First was Pedro, and I wasn't I wasn't commenting on that, but you're our second speaker who's basically has you both share a similar attitude, I think, and it is the attitude of we shouldn't worry as much about states of emergency. Although Pedro wasn't commenting so much, he wasn't theoretically commenting why we shouldn't worry about states of emergency. He was more practical, if we could say so, in his intentions. I was wondering if there is a general point to be made there, or if it's somewhat of a function of the system in which we live in, or is there a difference between different countries and their respective political systems? So you explicitly mentioned, for example, and that is explicitly mentioned, by the way, in our constitution, and probably also in the Slovenian constitution, it's not a Schmittian situation, because it's simply states of emergency in modern constitutions are, you could say, even hyper-regulated. When can you pronounce a state of emergency? Under which conditions? Which are the bodies that can act within a state of emergency? And in my opinion, all of that was successfully circumvented in Serbia, for example. So if there was an option to make it less democratical and more autocratic, it was used in Serbia. And on the other hand, I hear your talk and I hear Pedro's talk, and I was wondering about is there a consequence of your general theoretical position in regards to state of emergency, or just a consequence of trust in institutions in Slovenia that you might have, or Pedro's trust in institutions in Portugal that he might have?
That's a great question. I wouldn't be so daring as to say that I could generalize my response, maybe by comparative analysis, but I don't know enough systems in different countries to be able to say such a thing. But it's not only the question of trust in political institutions, it's also a question of looking a priori, let's say, at the constitutional design and trying to imagine its weak points where the autocratic element could come in. And obviously there are, as I tried to explain at the beginning, there are some points in the Slovenian system which could make some problems, especially with the kinds of events that could lead up to the declaration, let's say. It's completely vague there. Also the non-existence of a sunset clause, so time limit put on these measures. This is probably the gravest problem. But other than that, the maintaining of a balance between the parliament and the government, I think is particularly worth noting, because you can see that there's no trust in a particular, especially in the government, during such times. So yes, the government is the only body that can propose measures, but it has to pass them through the parliament. As I was saying, let's imagine that we have a situation where the government sees it fit to propose the restriction of one of the human rights or the constitutional rights that are expressly named in Constitution as absolute rights, as rights that cannot be limited, not even during the state of emergency. It's not an impossible scenario. I hope that the parliament, or in the case if it would be the president deciding, it would block such a decision, right? It's a hypothetical question, obviously, but still there is a balance of power there. Also, we shouldn't forget that once states decide to declare the state of emergency, at least in the broader European context, there are certain international obligations that kick in. So you have to regularly report to the Council of Europe as to what measures you are adopting and why. So there is a kind of a spotlight put on you to justify your decisions. So it's, on the one hand, I mean, obviously, I don't want to be offensive here, but if you are a politician with autocratic tendencies, let's say as in Hungary, then you don't care about what the international community says. But on the other hand, if you have to explain yourself before the international community and you care about their, you'll be more careful. If you decide on the business as usual model, so if you just try to adopt these measures in the normal way, then there is less of a necessity to justify them, at least in the international community. So I think this is also one of the reasons why politicians are trying to not declare the state of emergency. But the consequences of adopting urgent measures, restrictions of rights via this normal situation, normal legislative way, I think we should all remember the US Patriot Act from 2001 and the fact that most parts of that law, which heavily restricts the right to privacy, have become de facto part of the normal US law. So I think there's a lesson to be learned from this way of proceeding.
All right. Thank you, Matija.
Theodora, can I raise my real hand?
All right. But first, I'm sorry, Professor, but first, Anna. So she has priority here. Thank you, Matija, and thank you, Bojan, for the question. Now, Anna, you may ask your question.
Thank you, Theodora. Hello, everyone. I'm sorry, Professor, but I raised my hand first. So just a brief comment on the topic you already mentioned that has to do with absolute human rights. That is, as some of you know, my PhD topic. So I'm particularly interested in the question of non-derogable rights. You already said that there are some non-derogable rights according to the Slovenian constitution. I'd like to know if you can name some of them, because I'm afraid that we are yet to find out how the states did violate those absolute human rights during this corona time. And that is the main point why states of emergency are dangerous, according to me at least. And I'd like to point out to the Serbian constitution that as well has provided for non-derogable rights, but an unusual list of non-derogable rights, like 20 of them. And there are some rights that, according to their nature, should never be non-derogable nor absolute. So that was my kind of question or comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. That's actually a question I had also for Pedro, because from his list, I think it's practically the same in Slovenia as it is in Portugal. So mostly, I think there's 6 or 7 rights. Most of them are habeas corpus rights, so rights in the criminal procedure, and then the freedom of conscience, right? And I looked it up again after, I guess, a week ago. And this was a question I wanted to ask Pedro, but I think it's pertinent also in Serbia as elsewhere. I'm sorry to use your question for this semi-political comment, but it was shocking to me because I never thought about it earlier. Because during the lockdown, let's say in Slovenia, also religious services were suspended. But then at a certain point, a legal scholar from the Catholic Church went on radio and said, well, but we have such a thing as the separation of state and church, and the church is autonomous here in Slovenia, so we can do whatever we want. And we actually never had to obey the lockdown. We just did it, let's say, out of solidarity, but we can continue with the religious services whenever we want to, right? And I just thought that was shocking. And I did go to look up again in the Constitution, and the freedom of conscience of the religious services is, or freedom of religion, is one of the non-derogable rights, which of course, from one perspective, we can understand it, but you know, when we think about the practical aspect, so you know, assemblies of people in small places, it becomes problematic when we're in the situation of an epidemic. But yes, to go specifically to your answer, habeas corpus rights and freedom of conscience.
All right. Thank you, Anna, for your question. Thank you, Matija. Professor Jovanovic, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Theodora. Hi, Matija. This was really a great presentation. And I would like to return a bit to the question posed by Bojan, actually. And this is the question which is more from a political theory point of view. Probably you have come across this statement by a famous political theorist, Francis Fukuyama, that in these times of crisis, the major dividing line in effective crisis response will not be division between democracies and autocracies, but the state's overall capacity to generate trust among the population. And all the surveys that we have available show us that this was exactly the case all across Europe or other places, that simply in times of crisis, people turn to their governments, and we see figures like, for instance, in Germany, with a spectacular re-rise of the trust in Chancellor Merkel, or in Austria also, and Italy as well. So it seemed that irrespective of what was going on the ground, there was some sort of general trust in the government. So returning to your initial remark that it was one of the peculiarities that Slovenia entered the crisis with a minority government, basically with a split responsibility between the old government and the newly coming prime minister, and on the other hand, your overall remark at the beginning that the crisis management was successful. It seemed that the Slovenian case somehow goes against this Fukuyama's remark in the sense that irrespective of the minority government, which was not somehow mounting a strong power, and maybe it was not exactly for that reason unable to do so, there was enough trust by the population, or at least the crisis was managed successfully. So I'm just wondering to change slightly this perspective and to get the answer from this political theory angle. Thanks.
Thank you, Miodrag. I don't think the things are quite that simple in Slovenia. I don't know how much you've been following. I guess you haven't. But as a general remark, I would say that from what I've been able to observe, especially here in Italy, where I'm currently at, and in Slovenia, which I follow a bit more closely, is that, and I think more or less it was the same in most other countries, is that initially, yes, the people did abide by the orders, the lockdown. They were quite well-behaved citizens, regardless of the sacrifices that were, asked of them, regardless of the type of government that was in play, or the kind of legal acts that were imposed, whatever. I think that the initial response was a good one, and people did trust the governments, especially because that I think was only the beginning stages, at least in Slovenia, when the experts were speaking publicly, when every time, besides the politicians, there was also a medical expert speaking and explaining things. We saw in Italy every day less and less of these experts, and so I think one of the elements of this trust of people in government is also the temporal aspect and the transparency aspect. The longer the measures are and the less transparent that the government is with them, the less the people will be respected. Now, as for the Slovenian government, it has only been in power for 2 months, but I think if it were only to limit itself to the emergency measures, regardless of the fact that it's a problematic government with a problematic leader who was previously convicted of corruption and so on, I think it would have quite a large popularity. But at the same time, it took the possibility that this crisis gave it to make a lot of personnel changes and a lot of other changes in its policy, especially in its manner that it presents itself, that it speaks to foreign leaders, to the European community, and the way it speaks to the media. Also, there was a big scandal with emergency equipment, a big corruption scandal, which is the trust quite. There aren't much discussions on whether or not the emergency measures, the restrictions were appropriate or not. There have been some, obviously, but I think that's the least important part for the people. What in Slovenia, at least, has been the predominant discussion is how this government tried to take advantage of the situation for opening ideological topics. and so it's not enjoying much popularity. And we'll see what happens once all the restrictions are ended. Already during these restrictions, there have been two major demonstrations before the parliament. The last time, I think there were more than 10,000 people on bicycles protesting. So you can see that while they were all, most of them respective of the measures, so they were mostly wearing masks and stuff, they still thought that in such a short time, the government did so many emergency that it's not, as you said at the beginning, it was not able to generate much trust in the people.
All right, thank you, Professor, and thank you, Matija, for the answer. So since some of us had problems with this hand-raising option, if anyone has any further question, can you please write it in chat or simply just ask it, so we will arrange something. I will just see the chat now. Because I don't know if it functions for everybody. Yeah, for now, no. All right. So maybe if
Matija had raised his hand.
Just a second. Yeah, that isn't shown on my screen, but please, Matija, go forward because I can't see your hand. So.
I can't hear you, Matija.
One moment. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, and it got me thinking. The Constitution, it must create a framework even case scenario, and it is written in the Constitution that this emergency scenario also is knows the, in a case. It got me thinking, if we are the thesis that only the parliament can derogate some rights, how that would be really inefficient, for example, in the times of war, when simply it's not possible for the assembly to assemble. And then I believe it should be left to the president to have the power, even in the worst case scenario, if it's factually impossible for the constitution, for the assembly to constitute, to be able to derogate even more touchy rights, because it seems like a constitutional weakness to me. And as you have already said, some sort of unnecessary phobia from these extraordinary measures, because in the end the point of that is to, as it is written, preserve the country and the state, and I don't see why should it shoot itself in the foot with those limitations. So that's my, I don't know if it's a question, just my 2 cents on it.
Thanks. This gives me the opportunity to mention another thing which I try to evade. Regulations, constitutional, the same article speaks also about war. So when it mentions the state of emergency, it also mentions war. So all of the rules that I was discussing apply to the situations of war. Now, there's an interesting, so I think that your problem that you mentioned has now, at least they've tried to resolve this problem. So if the parliament can convene also online, then that should make it possible for them to deliberate also during a state of war, let's say. And this all speaks to a broader problem, which I haven't had well, there's actually 2 problems, but I didn't have the time to deal with them. One is, I think, and this one I know a little bit better, which is an overall distrust in the Slovenian constitution makers in the figure of the president. because of the historical circumstances, the people who were writing the constitution were mostly of right-leaning parties, right-wing leaning parties. But it was established. They knew as a fact that the first president of the republic will be a left-wing politician. So they try to remove as much powers as possible from the president of the republic. And these are the consequences that we have now. We have a very weak president, although he or she is elected by popular vote. Another thing is more problematic, and I don't know much about it, but I think that this unwillingness to discuss, to regulate, to enter into a state of emergency in the Slovenian system the former Yugoslavia, where the state of emergency was used quite often to regulate issues. And so I think from my discussions, personal discussions from the professors who are involved in the writing of the Constitution, I think that was their major problem, although I don't know it enough to be able to comment further on it. But I did get the sense that the past experience was something that, you know, they knew that they had to regulate it in some manner, but they wanted to, you know, leave it for someone else in some way.
All right, thank you, Matija. So as I don't see any question raised, Matija, do you maybe see a question raised? Because
I don't.
Okay.
No physical hands raised.
No physical or virtual hands raised. All right. Thank you a lot for this great discussion, despite this minor tech difficulties. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Matija, for your great presentation. I think we can close this session today, and hope to see you all next week. We will let you know about the details via our platforms online. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for listening in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matija.